Picture yourself marooned on an isolated island, surrounded by nothing but the roar of the ocean and the whispering sway of palm leaves for solace. The vessel you boarded just days ago has shattered against the nearby reef, leaving you as the sole survivor of your entire crew. With scarce supplies and no signs of rescue on the horizon, you are thrust into a true trial of endurance, depending solely on your intelligence and relentless will to stay alive. This was the exact predicament faced by Pedro Serrano, a man whose astonishing tale has echoed through history for more than 4.5 centuries. Come along as we explore Pedro's courageous struggle against hunger, loneliness, and the elements. Pedro Serrano, lost to the depths. Because of the story's age, there's very little concrete detail available about Pedro Serrano's origins or early years. What is generally accepted, however, is that around the mid-1500s, this Spanish sailor joined the crew of a trade ship embarking on a journey across the Atlantic Ocean toward the Americas. But what began as a routine voyage soon turned into a harrowing ordeal. One disastrous night, a fierce tempest struck the ship with devastating force, tearing it apart. The entire crew was killed, except for Pedro. Gifted with strong swimming ability, he fought through the chaos and managed to make it to a tiny, uninhabited island located off the northeastern shoreline of South America, far removed from any commonly traveled sea lanes. Though the island's precise location is still debated, many believe it to have been Serrano Bank, a remote sandy atoll in the Caribbean Sea. When Pedro woke the following day, the harsh reality of his predicament became clear. The land was barren. There was hardly any plant life aside from patches of grass and a handful of scattered trees. But most alarming of all, the island lacked any source of fresh drinking water, dramatically reducing his odds of survival. Pedro immediately began searching both the island and the surrounding coral reef for anything edible. Eventually, he came across a small number of shellfish, which he had no choice but to eat raw. These provided temporary nourishment, but Pedro knew that if he hoped to endure for an extended period on the isolated atoll, he would need a more dependable source of food. Fortune struck one day as he explored a shallow lagoon. There, near the shore, he spotted turtles gliding through the water, an encouraging sign. He understood this meant they would likely come ashore during the night to lay eggs. As evening approached, Pedro concealed himself behind a rocky ledge, remaining completely silent as darkness enveloped the beach. Hours dragged by under a heavy, oppressive stillness. Then, at last, the turtles began to crawl from the sea, slowly making their way onto the sand. Acting swiftly, Pedro used the knife, a valuable item he had managed to salvage from the shipwreck, to capture and kill several turtles. He fed on their meat for sustenance and ingeniously repurposed their shells to collect rainwater, a rare but absolutely vital lifeline for survival. Igniting a flame, days stretched into weeks, and weeks slowly turned into months. Pedro endured the unforgiving climate, exposed to the blazing heat and violent tempests without any shelter to shield him. He survived solely on the turtles that crawled ashore and the rainwater that pooled in their hollowed shells during storms. As time wore on, Pedro became consumed with the search for a way to create fire. He understood it would do more than cook his meals. It could also serve as a beacon, a signal to any ships that might pass by. The shores of the island were strewn with dried seaweed, driftwood, and debris from other shipwrecks. Ample fuel if only he had the means to spark a flame. Though his knife could act as the steel in a fire-starting set, locating a proper stone was the real obstacle. The island was essentially just a barren stretch of sand, harsh, dry, and unyielding. There was no flint to be found. Unwilling to give up, Pedro turned his attention to the ocean. An experienced diver, he plunged beneath the surface again and again, scouring the seafloor in hopes of discovering stones that might mimic flint. After numerous dives and countless attempts, he finally surfaced with two promising rocks that looked and felt right in his hands. With renewed determination, he returned to shore and began striking the stones together until he managed to carve a sharp edge. Earlier, he had already gathered a small pile of dried seaweed to use as tinder. Holding his improvised flint in one hand and his trusty knife in the other, he struck them together. It took several tries, each one filled with tension, but then, at last, a spark leapt onto the dry fibers. The tinder caught, and soon flames danced before him. The fire hissed and crackled, a fragile but powerful triumph over the endless solitude. For the first time in many long months, Pedro tasted warm food. That single hot meal, humble as it was, rekindled not just his strength, but his spirit. The stranger Pedro had now endured 3 long years on the desolate island. During that time, his clothing had completely worn away, and his hair and beard had grown wild and unkempt. His body had begun to adjust to the brutal climate, developing a coarse layer of body hair that offered limited defense against the relentless weather. He often caught sight of ships far off on the horizon, but despite his desperate signals, none took notice. The solitude was crushing. One can only imagine the psychological toll, days merging into one another, a cycle of fleeting hope sparked by distant sails, and the deep despair that followed when they sailed on without stopping. Then, one extraordinary morning, Pedro was jolted awake. As he blinked through the smoky haze of his campfire, he saw something that made his heart nearly stop, a human face watching him through the swirling smoke. It was another man. Like Pedro, he was Spanish and had been shipwrecked the night before. He had clung to a piece of floating wreckage and washed ashore during the night. As the stranger approached, both men were paralyzed by fear. The newcomer was startled by Pedro's savage, almost beast-like appearance, and Pedro, nearly broken by years of isolation, was stunned at the sight of another human being. His mind raced. Was this real, or some demonic illusion? Terrified, they both fled in opposite directions, each convinced the other was a phantom or a trick of the devil. In his panic, Pedro cried aloud, pleading with the heavens to protect him from what he believed was a supernatural being. The other man, hearing Pedro's anguished prayer, stopped in his tracks. Recognizing the Spanish tongue and the desperation in it, he called out, "Brother, don't run. I am a Christian just like you." Relieved and overcome with emotion, the two men slowly approached and confirmed each other's humanity. From that moment on, their lives changed. They formed a new rhythm together, sharing responsibilities, tending to the fire, collecting seaweed, fishing, and salvaging driftwood. With both of them working in unison, they were able to flip and catch much larger turtles, improving their food supply considerably. The years trudged on, 4 more in total. The pair would often gaze out at passing ships, their hope rising and falling with each one that sailed by, oblivious to their presence. But finally, one day, a vessel came nearer than any before. The men rushed to their signal fire, frantically feeding it to produce thick smoke. And this time, their signal worked. A small boat detached from the ship and headed for the island. Overcome with joy and desperation, Pedro and his companion sprinted toward their rescuers. But the sight of 2 scruffy, wild-looking men charging from the jungle filled the sailors with fear. They thought they were under attack by savages. Serrano and his companion shouted in Spanish, pleading for them to wait. Eventually, the rescuers realized these weren't monsters, but fellow Spaniards, marooned survivors of incredible endurance. The 2 men were taken aboard the ship, which was bound for Spain. During the voyage, Pedro recounted the unbelievable story of how he had survived 7 years on a remote and unforgiving atoll. Tragically, the journey home proved too much for his companion, whose health had been too severely weakened by the years of hardship. He died before reaching Spain. Once again alone, Pedro bore the weight of their shared survival and the painful memories of what they had endured. Upon returning to Spain sometime after 1550, he was reunited with his family, who had long since presumed him lost to the sea. He would spend the rest of his life telling the extraordinary story, a living testament to the power of human will in the face of unthinkable adversity. Pedro Serrano's survival tale remains a stark reminder of the fine line that separates life and death, and of how far a person can go when pushed to their limits. His story, preserved in the royal commentaries of Peru by Garcilaso de la Vega, continues to echo through time as a tribute to the strength of the human spirit. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into true survival. If you found this story powerful, subscribe for more incredible journeys of endurance and human adventure. Until next time, stay safe and stay curious.